Well, hi everyone. I'm joined today by Nawab Osman from NTU in Singapore. He's a coordinator of the Malaysia program, and also by Sophie Lemiére, who's from the EUI and from our Middle East Directions program. They've both been participating in our conference on rethinking the Middle East. Maybe I'll start with you, Nawab. Tell us a little bit about the situation in Singapore and in Malaysia. What kind of a role has the Middle East, specifically the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, what kind of role have they been playing in Islamic mobilization and in the politics of the region?
I think, the links between the Middle East and Southeast Asia in particular has been a historical one. Obviously, the coming of Islam in particular from Yemen has been a significant sort of way of conversion within the region. And in more recent times, I think there are several trends in terms of Islamist mobilization that probably impact Southeast Asia. The first, perhaps, is the mobilization in terms of political parties and so on. So you have, for example, the Prosperity Justice Party in Indonesia, which has been described by Yusuf Al-Qaradawi as the extension of the Brotherhood in Indonesia. You also have the Islamic Party of Malaysia that has long had a relationship and has been influenced by the Brotherhood. The second tendency would be that of the Salafi movement. And here we're looking at all types of manifestation of Salafism, from the quietist position to even the Sahwa position, and perhaps the Jumaat Jihadis type of network that we see. And relations are quite evident in terms of how what's happening in Saudi Arabia, in particular how they impact politics in the region.
Okay. And Sophie, you've been working both in Singapore, Malaysia region, and then recently in North Africa. How would you compare the two scenarios, particularly in terms of political mobilization?
Well, I've been working mostly in Malaysia and then in Tunisia, and it's very interesting because I think we're in two. It's always a long stretch to try to compare two different countries. So the best is, of course, to compare phenomenon. Let's put it that way. What's very interesting about both countries that I would say that Tunisia is where Malaysia could be in terms of transition towards a democratization process. And it's really what I'm looking at this transitional context, and what kind of relationship are being developed between so-called civil society agents or political actors within civil society and political parties. So recently I've been looking a lot at the Islamist party in both countries, for example, and we have very interesting phenomenon here, and the evolution in terms of mobilization, but in terms of ideology as well, has changed a lot. And here you would expect that the Tunisian revolution would have influenced a lot the rhetoric of the Islamist party in Malaysia, and I think my colleague here would agree with me that in fact the influence was quite limited, and I was very surprised about that, despite the fact that there are exchanges between individuals within both parties. So we see, this kind of distanciation from the classic or traditional Islamic rhetoric of the Brotherhood within the Islamist party in Tunisia that we don't really see in Malaysia yet. And it's very interesting. So this new face of Nahda in Tunisia as being this basically branding itself or rebranding itself as the new CDU, if I may, the Christian Democrat Party in Germany, this is not happening yet in Malaysia. Right.
And if I may add,
Sure.
I think what's interesting is the fact that Malaysia, the Islamic Party in Malaysia, has had a longer history of actually participating in democratic process,
Indeed.
in electoral process.
Indeed.
And yet, you have not seen the moderation happen, whereas in Tunisia, where you've had a long history of repression and authoritarian rule, the party was adept in terms of how they dealt with, and I think that's perhaps one of the most
exactly. Yeah, I think it's exactly the point. And the fact that this Islamist party in Tunisia grew in exile, basically, has been influenced a lot by a secular system in Europe. For example, we know Ghanouchi was in the UK for the longest time, and a lot of the founders from the Islamist party in exile were in France as well. So they really, I think, enriched enrich the discourse and maybe their ideology and views, or really manage to find a consensus within, a different system and try to bring back, the best of what they learned in Europe with all of what they had as well from the Middle East and the other experiences. And it's something that the Islamist Party of Malaysia did not went through this very critical thinking, period of time. And today we've seen a split actually in the Malaysian Islamist Party with a new branch that claimed to be more modernist, but again, they failed completely into changing the rhetoric and leaving aside, for example, the implementation of Sharia, which is something that has been striking about Nahda, and they completely let it go during the discussion around the constitution in Tunisia.
It's an interesting point, and of course, historically, there's always been a two-way travel. I mean, we were talking earlier in the conference about the Maududi movement starting in the Indian subcontinent, still during the colonial period. Is there today now influence going the opposite direction from, say, from Malaysia, influencing discourse in the Middle East?
I think what's interesting is that Malaysia was often cited, I believe, by people in Nahda as the example of a moderate sort of Islamic party that has functioned within a democratic process, has never ever taken up arms, and so on. But I think increasingly they're beginning to realize that, in fact, there is a problem in the way the rhetoric in Malaysia has been. But on a separate note, I think the president of the party, Abdul Hadi Awang, is in fact a very influential figure, I think, in terms of worldwide Islamic political mobilization. I can give you one example. Right after the Arab Spring, when the Brotherhood took over, they won the election. There was a delegation from Malaysia that went to Egypt, and there was a very interesting photo of how Hadi Awang led all the top Egyptian Brotherhood leaders in prayers. And that's significant because if you know Islamic sort of tradition, when you're traveling, you're often encouraged to follow, not be the leader. So the fact that he was appointed, that says a lot in terms of how they viewed him. Yeah.
So do you think that there is increasingly, we could talk increasingly of a global community, a global Islamist community? And if so, what effect is that having on the dynamics of conflicts, disorders, what's happening in Syria, Iraq, places like that?
I think, interestingly, this global network of Islamic political parties, I think it's always been there. It's not something new. I think perhaps in the 90s they've realized, and I believe it was the 1990 Gulf War that sort of triggered this need to sort of bring everyone together. But I think more interestingly, is the fact that what is happening worldwide today is actually positive in the sense that you have a moderation of Islamic political parties, and that process, I mean, not just in Tunisia, but also in Morocco, to a lesser extent today in the AKP in Turkey. And that, I think, has an influence, has an effect of sort of moderating the whole discourse. So a political party like PAS, for instance, would seem a little bit on the margins right now in terms of how the world of Islamism has worked.
Well, well, in terms of relationship really between these ideas that you had about Islam is globalized or whatever, the relationship date actually even before. I mean, because a lot of Malaysian Islamists were actually have been sent to study in the UK, in Egypt as well, in Syria, and so it's when they actually get in touch with people from the Brotherhood, Ikhwan, etc. And it's actually the kind of ideas in Islamism, if I may, or political Islam, that they brought back to Malaysia, and then creating an Islamic civil society as we see it today, and investing then the Islamist Party of Malaysia. So I think the coalition here, I mean the collusion or network here date long back, and then in terms of the positioning in the context that we're in today, that is very peculiar. It seems that when you're an Islamist, you have to, be very zealous in terms of proving that you're actually not a terrorist because of all the amalgams that are being done. I think in the term of Nahda, it is very interesting what's happening right now. It's like the renaming, again, this idea of rebranding the party. And one of the most recent discourse of Rashid Ghannouchi was actually to explained that he was not that comfortable anymore with being called an Islamist, but that he was seeing himself as an Islamo-democrat or even a Muslim democrat. And that's a very, very interesting move. And I think that again, this has been built in a response to the context we're in today and the vision, the European and Western vision in general of political Islam and the misunderstanding around political Islam. And again, I think in Southeast Asia, we don't have, again, this clear step, towards this distance, towards certain principle, I would say, or certain foundation of what we see as being the political Islam thought,
And if I may just add one point, though, I think it's also interesting to note, not just in Southeast Asia, but also in South Asia, that the Jamaat-e-Islami in particular has had problems rebranding. I mean, they're still sticking to the old rhetoric, despite the fact that they have not done well in the elections in Pakistan and also in Bangladesh. But they have stuck on to that rhetoric of wanting an Islamic state, implementing the Sharia and so on. So I think it's rather interesting to see that the center has changed, if you like, to see it between the center versus periphery. But the periphery has not in a lot of ways, I would say.
And I believe that it's very linked as well to the fact that this periphery, but again, more talking about Malaysia, is that Islamism has come as being definitely a reaffirmation of ethnic identity. And that's why it is extremely hard as well for the Islamist Party in Malaysia to take what would be perceived as a step back from their own rhetoric and then losing on the ethnic ground. And I think this really dual linkage, of ethnicity and religion, as it is in Malaysia, is playing a very important role in the fact that the rhetoric has not reformed itself yet.
Yeah, these are interesting themes, and it's interesting that they've come up a number of times in the panels that we've held. Yesterday, Teodonka was talking about the dilemma of Islamists, if you like, between trying to reform existing institutions or creating new institutions. If we're talking more widely about the kind of the global challenge which Islamist parties are facing, what's the current model that they can look to? Because previously people would have said, well, look at Turkey, look at Erdogan. Now Erdogan's moving to a much more arguably authoritarian posture. Is it possible now that people might start looking towards South Asia, Southeast Asia, as a more moderate role model?
I think it's interesting, but there has been a perception somehow that South or Southeast Asia, are somehow more moderate, when in actuality it's not. I mean, it's in a lot of ways, I think the discourse is still very conservative. And I think increasingly, though, parties, for example, like the new party, the National Mandate Party in Malaysia, which is, if you like, they're trying to position themselves as a post-Islamist party, to borrow, of course, Olivier Roy's term. And I think they are not necessarily looking at any models per se. I think they're beginning to realize that they need to rethink the context in which they are functioning is different. They can borrow from numerous sources, including from the West. And I think that realization is increasingly becoming, a reality. At the end of it, we have to remember that these are political parties. It's politics first, Islam or religion second. At the end of it, it's about winning elections. It's not so much about the ideological pursuit. And when you go into that sort of, position of trying to win elections and so on, obviously, you have to compromise on certain ideals in that sense.
Well, I would have positioned myself a little bit differently on that. I would think that actually, this new branching out basically of the Islamist Party in Malaysia, their problem is in fact that they're not political enough, and that they are not thinking in terms of strategy. And I had later in January, I had a discussion with some of the founder of this new branch, and I told them, well, do you want to win election? Is that because they were asking me, okay, well, why it doesn't work? Well, because you're not strategists. So, if you want to win an election, maybe you have to concede a little bit, on some ground, because, of course, the implementation of Sharia in Malaysia is not appealing to, the Chinese constituency or the Indian constituency, the non-Muslim constituency in general. So I think that a party that has been extremely strategic is Nahda, definitely. I mean, they really learn the lesson and to really learn how to compose with, despite the fact that Nahda is an Islamist party or a Muslim Democrat party in a country where Muslim are the majorities, the large majorities. And I think again that's the problem in Malaysia, is that the majority is not that large.
It's only 65% or so.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this was an interesting paradox actually that Nagwan Abdel Mahmoud told us about yesterday when she was talking about Jemaah Islamiyah in Egypt, that they were always perceived as a more hardline Islamist party. But they were actually willing to compromise more and to take on more democratic norms when it came to the post-Arab Spring environment. A final word, because our program is Middle East directions. A final word then on directions. What do you see, both of you, as the future direction for political Islam?
I think, at the end of it, the project, the political Islam project, I think Olivier Roy obviously talked about this years back. I think it has come to, if you like, it has failed. And I think it is better, if you ask me, in terms of the future direction, if Islamic political parties in general understand or realize that the project itself is not one that you can pursue in the same way. That at the end of it, you need to change strategies, you need to start, perhaps moderating certain positions, adopting certain ideas that might not necessarily be emanating from Islam. And I think then they can function as a proper, the paradox, I guess, or the pull, the tension has always been about winning elections and sticking to, if you like, principles. And I think they have to understand now that the guys who have moved on, who have won elections and who have formed governments, perhaps less principled, if you ask me, in terms of their position towards Islamism. And I think that should be the future direction. And if they pursue that, I think there's a good chance that we might actually have, if you like, moderate Muslim Democrats all around the Muslim world.
Yeah, I think as long as, this move really has to keep Islam as a strong reference, like kind of a reference code, for political parties in general, is the good one. And it's obviously that's been proven to be efficient to win election at some point in Malaysia, in Tunisia. And it's really, I think, the tendency. And indeed, when Olivier Roy spoke about, the failure of political Islam already 20 years ago, it's really what we're facing now, as my colleague said. So political Islam is not dead per se, but the way it was, the view and the way it was being framed, of course, is just outdated. Yeah. It just doesn't work. So there is, and it clearly shows now. So I think that a lot of parties have been, and people, individual organization, it's not only on the party level, have been able to come to that conclusion too. And there is a real effort to reform and a real tendency to critiques and even to self-critique as well, and evolution, which is very healthy. And even more, I think, in this very dual black and white context that we live in, the good thing, if we may see a good thing in there, it's the critics that comes out of it, and the constructive critic that we can all use, Islamist and non-Islamist. But.
So our ultimate conclusion is that Olivier was right after all.
Olivier was right. Did we need to debate to know that?
Well, thanks to you, Sophie, and thanks
Thank you so much.
And thanks for watching. And join us for the debate on med.eui.eu.
Thank you.
Thank you.